Alright, so we've spent some time simplifying some expressions that were kind of basic, and now we're going to start looking at simplifying some expressions that are just a little more difficult. There's just a little more to it. Today's work is basically just going to combine the two different things that we talked about. So the first thing we talked about was combining like terms. And we talked about that like terms have the same variable, so the same letter attached, or no letter at all, and we can put them together, combine them, and we start off with a bunch of terms, and then we simplify it to have less terms. We also talked about using the distributive property, or distributing, to simplify problems that have parentheses. So if there's a number that's being multiplied times a quantity, you can take that number and multiply it by all the terms that are in the inside of the parentheses. So today we're just going to combine both of those kind of in one. So when we look at 29, I see these parentheses being multiplied by 4 plus 9x. So it's important to see that only the 4 is being multiplied by this quantity. The plus 9x is on the end. So I've got this plus 9x. So my first step is going to be to distribute and get rid of these parentheses, just like we did yesterday. And so this plus 9x is not going to be affected at all. So I can literally just bring that plus 9x down, and I'll worry about it on my next step. So right now, I'm just multiplying the 4 times the 3x and the 4 times the negative 4. I'm distributing. Plus 9x is just going to stay. So 4 times 3x is 12x. And then again, I said negative 4 because a minus 4 is like a negative 4. You could say plus negative 4 if that helps you kind of understand why we're doing that. So 4 times negative 4 is negative 16. And we always write that as minus 16. You could write plus negative 16, but adding negative 16 and minusing 16 are the same thing. So we're going to make it as simple as possible. So instead of writing plus a negative, we're just going to write minus. So when you get a negative, you write minus. All right, so now I have one more step. So I've distributed. Now I need to combine like terms. So every one of these problems is going to be different. Sometimes there's going to be more than one whole number to combine. Sometimes there's more than one term with the same variable. So in this case, I've got a 12x. And I've got a plus 9x. Remember when we box these in, we include the plus or the minus that's in front of the number because that counts as the positive or the negative of my value. So these are both positive. I'm just combining a 12x and a 9x. So that comes out to a 21x. And I have a minus 16. There's nothing for it to combine with. So I am just going to tag it on the end. This is my final simplified answer. So I started off kind of with something that was complicated. And we talked about that these two are equivalent or equal, which means if I chose to plug in a number for x into this expression and into this expression, and then I completely ran the numbers, they're both going to produce the same answer. So these are equal to each other. And in fact, this middle one is also equivalent. Okay, these are all equivalent. If you plugged in for x the same number in all three, they're all going to produce the same value. But this one is clearly the simplest. There's the least amount going on, and if I wanted to produce an answer quickly, it's much easier to multiply this number by 21 and then subtract 6 than try and plug in here and work everything. And even here in the middle, you'd have to do 2 multiplications, a subtraction, and addition. Here, I'm just multiplying and then subtracting. So they all produce the same answer, but this is the simplest. So this is why we're doing this. So when these are actually applied to some practical matters, we always want to use the simplest one, so it's the easiest. So as we move on to number 30 now, first thing I want you to start looking at is what number in these is not being affected by the distributing. So the 4 is being multiplied by the x and the 9. This is a minus 2. It's not a negative 2 being multiplied by this. It's a minus 2. The 4 is what's being multiplied. So this minus 2 is just going to hang around until step 2. So I've got 4x minus 36. Alright, so like I said, over here I had two of the same things that had a variable. Over here I don't, but I have two things that don't have variables. So those two are my like terms, and those can be combined. Now our final answer is correct form has the variables first. So I'm going to start with my 4x. There's nothing that it can combine with, so it just comes down. Negative 36 and negative 2. You're adding them together. Or you could think of it as negative 36 minus 2, because plus negative 2 is the same thing. I just like to look at them as the numbers themselves with the negatives, and I'm just adding them together. So when I add a negative 36 and a negative 32, that's a negative 38, which I write as a minus, and that's my final answer. Okay, same idea on 31. We've just got kind of more negatives to deal with, more minuses. So the minus 10 is coming down. Nothing there that I can do with it. This is the distribution. So negative 4 times 7 is negative 28k. And now, again, this is a negative 4, and this is a negative 9. So when I multiply a negative times a negative, that's a positive. So I have to write plus here. Plus 36. Okay, what is alike? Well, the 36 and the negative 10 are alike because they don't have variables, which means this negative 28k does not have anything to combine with, so it will just be in our final answer. And a positive 36 and a negative 10, or a 36 minus 10, is a positive, so I write plus 26. Okay, 32 looks a little different. The number that's being distributed is the 7. That's what's being multiplied by this quantity. And then this plus 5b is off on its own. So the plus 5b is kind of just what hangs on the end. And I'm multiplying the 7 times both of these. All right, so 7 times the 9 is 63b. And 7 times 4 is positive, so I put plus 28. So in this problem, the variable b has 2 terms, so I can combine those. So a 63 and a 5 is a 68b, and the plus 28 is all on its own, nothing like it, so it will just come to our final answer. All right, I want you to try number 33. I'm going to give you a second. Okay, if you still need more time, you can pause the video. So I'm going to distribute the negative 8 to both of these. This minus 10b is not affected by the multiplication, so it's going to come down. So negative 8 times 2 is negative 16b. Try and make your 6 and your b look a little different. Negative 8, this is times a negative 3, so this is a negative times a negative, which is a positive, so I must write plus 24. So the two things that are alike are the b's. They're both negative, so they're just going to combine and make more negatives. So it's going to be a negative 26b. That's negative 16 and negative 10 make negative 26. And then this plus 24 is on the end. So hopefully you got that right. If you didn't, hopefully you see kind of your mistakes, and then you can clean that up. So now we're going to look at a couple ones that are tricky. So there's some weird negatives and some weird spots that we have to consider. So when we look at 34, 34 has this minus that's in front. The plus 8b is not affected. The plus 8b is what's coming down. So we need to do something with this negative. So we've talked about this kind of already. When there's a negative like that, it's really a negative 1. So this is a negative 1. Negative 1. Being multiplied times both of these. Well, when you multiply by negative 1, the number, the digit doesn't change. Still a 2 and a 9. But the positives and the negatives will change when you multiply by a negative. So a negative 1 times a positive 2 makes a negative 2b. And this is a negative 1 times a negative 9. Negative times a negative is a positive 9. So my combination now is the two terms with the b, a negative 2 and a positive 8 makes a 6. Again, make your 6's and your b's look different. And then the plus 9 goes on the end. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We just need to know that's a negative 1. So 35. Need to be careful with our negatives. So this 6, and we're going to talk about it's actually a negative 6, but this 6 is what is being distributed. This negative 4n is off on its own. So the negative 4n is what comes down. So we've had a bunch where they're on the right side. It can be on the left side. And this minus 6 is being distributed. So we need to consider this a negative 6 when we're multiplying. So negative 6 times a negative 4 is a positive. So you write plus 24. And a negative 6 times a positive 10 is a negative. So we write minus 60n. All right, from here it's easy. Find your two like terms and combine them. That's going to give me negative 64n plus 24. All right, this last one, 36, combines what we talked about on 34 and what we talked about on 35. So I'm going to give you a minute to try it and see if you can think about all the things we just talked about on 34 and 35 and make sense of 36. Okay, so the 8 is not being multiplied times any of this. The 8 is on its own, so that's what's going to come down here. This minus is like this minus up here, or this negative sign. It's like there's a negative 1 out here. So the negative 1 is what's being distributed to both of these numbers. So it's a negative 1 times a 4, which is negative, so I write minus 4. And it's a negative 1 times a negative 2. Negative times a negative is a positive, so I put plus 2n. Okay, to simplify here, this is the only n. The like terms are the 8 and the minus 4. So I'm going to start by putting my variable up front. So 2n is the first part. And then I need to combine these. An 8 and a negative 4 is a positive 4. 8 minus 4 is positive 4. So it is plus 4. All right, so that's how we simplify these expressions that start off a little more difficult. There's some distributing plus. There's another number being added or subtracted. So you're going to handle the distributing first. And then your second step is to combine your like terms.